I once believed I was lucky to survive the crash in 1999. I used to call them family, until the day my adoptive father died. At his funeral, they looked at me like a stain no one dared to wipe off. My name wasn't in the will, not in the farewell, not in a single photo on the wall. But what haunted me the most was a handwritten note he left, unsigned. The one most deserving is the one being hunted. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Don't forget to subscribe for the next shocking episodes. We uncover the truths they tried to bury. It happened at 11:49 p.m. on a forgotten stretch of highway just outside of Worcester, Massachusetts. No other cars, no tire marks to trace back. Just a crumpled blue sedan wrapped around the guardrail, smoke hissing from its cracked hood. And inside, silence. Except for the faintest sound almost missed in the chaos. A child's cry. By the time the paramedics arrived, 2 adults were already gone. Front seats mangled beyond hope. But in the back, pressed between a toppled suitcase and a collapsed car seat, was a girl no older than 4. Bruised, bleeding, still breathing. No ID, no documents, no name. The ER nurse labeled her as Jane Doe 1999B. The press called her the Miracle Girl. And the story spread tragic, captivating. A child pulled from wreckage with no past, no people, and no answers. But the Kane family didn't read tragedy in the headlines. They read opportunity. Judge Harold Kane had spent decades on the bench building a pristine legacy, bulletproof and cold. His wife Carla ran a foundation for children displaced by conflict and catastrophe. On paper, a portrait of compassion. In person, something else entirely. 3 weeks after the crash, Carla Kane walked into the hospital wearing pearl earrings and a cashmere coat the color of bone. She held the child's face between gloved hands and smiled. The girl didn't flinch. "She looks like she's used to silence," Carla said to the social worker. "We'll take her." There was no official adoption. Just an expedited guardianship order signed quietly behind closed chambers. The kind that bypassed systems. The kind only power could push through. The girl was renamed Amara Kane. She didn't ask where she came from. No one encouraged the question. The Kanes preferred stories with beginnings they could control, and Amara learned early that her new world had rules. The house on Hensley Hill was vast, stone-faced, and sterile. The ceilings whispered when the wind passed through the beams, and the windows never opened more than an inch. There were rugs thick enough to silence footsteps, and a staircase that never creaked no matter how slow you climbed it. Breakfast was at 7:00 sharp. Shoes off at the foyer. Questions answered only when asked. And love, if that's what it was doled out in structured increments. A pat on the head, a scheduled holiday photo, a trophy mounted before the applause faded. There were rooms she was allowed in, and rooms she wasn't. 12 doors lined the second-floor hall, each numbered in bronze. Her bedroom was number 5. Carla's studio was 8. Harold's study was 10. But number 13, that door stayed locked. It didn't just remain closed, it was avoided. Cleaners skipped it, guests ignored it. Even Carla walked past it like it wasn't there. Amara once asked about it once. She was 9, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's in that room?" Carla had frozen mid-step. "What room?" "Number 13. Carla turned, smiled. The way people do when a dog has chewed their shoe and they're trying not to scream. "There is no 13, sweetheart. It's just a door to nowhere." And that was that. Time moved the way it always does in cold houses, quietly, efficiently, without drama. Amara grew into her silence like a second skin. She was polite, precise, and well-behaved. She got good grades, sat with perfect posture, and never raised her voice unless instructed to project during public speaking class. To the outside world, she was the Kane's pride, a symbol of second chances and social responsibility. The foundation used her face in pamphlets once she turned 15, just enough maturity to look composed, just enough youth to look saved. But the house told a different story. At night, the walls whispered in drafts. The pipes ticked in the cold. Sometimes the door to number 13 would hum like someone had leaned against it from the inside. She never touched it again, not after the first time. She had been 11, alone after school. Carla was at a luncheon, Harold in court, and curiosity burned hotter than fear. She'd crept down the hall, barefoot, breath held. She reached for the knob, faint dust on brass. Turned it. Nothing. Locked. But as she leaned in her ear pressed to wood, she swore she heard it scratching. Slow. Rhythmic. Like paper being dragged across stone. She ran, and never mentioned it again. Not to anyone. Because by then, she already knew questions didn't live long in the Kane house. By 17, she'd built a life of straight lines. Ivy League acceptance, Model UN awards, a part-time internship at Carla's own foundation, a spotless resume of gratitude. But deep down, she remained a stranger in her own name, because something in her always knew she hadn't just been saved. She'd been chosen, and one day, she would find out why. The morning of Harold Kane's funeral began with a sky too bright for mourning. There were no clouds, no gentle breeze, only a sun that poured itself over the city like it had never heard of grief. Reporters stood at the edge of the gated cemetery murmuring to each other behind sunglasses and camera lenses. Microphones were already pointed toward the black sedans before the engines even shut off. The Kane name even in death had gravity. They called him the Iron Judge in the papers, stoic, incorruptible, beloved by the legal elite. His funeral wasn't just a farewell, it was a public statement. Amara stepped out of the car without speaking. Her dress was slate gray. No jewelry, hair pulled back. She didn't wear grief on her sleeve, she wore it in her stillness. Carla stood at the head of the ceremony, chin lifted, surrounded by associates and distant relatives who clung to each other like political favors. When Carla saw Amara approach, she offered a practiced smile, not warmth but compliance. A gesture that said, "We'll get through this, just stay in line." The casket was closed. The air smelled of roses and disinfectant. A choir hummed something sacred, but the sound barely registered. Amara didn't cry. She didn't trust the ground enough to collapse. The eulogy was delivered by a federal judge, not a family member. Not even someone Harold had known intimately, but someone with the right voice, the right weight, the right words. When the speech ended, Carla stepped forward to place a single white lily on the casket. The cameras clicked like clockwork. And just like that, it was over. The guests filtered into the reception room of the Kane estate, where waiters carried trays of wine and tiny folded napkins. The whispers started quickly, as they always do, low, sharp, speculative. "She looks nothing like them." "I heard she wasn't even legally adopted. Did you see her name on the official list?" "Nom." "Exactly." Amara moved through them like glass seen but never touched. The reading of the will took place that afternoon in the paneled study where Harold had once taught her how to balance a checkbook. The same room where he'd corrected her grammar mid-sentence, mid-breath. The same room where silence had always meant, "Don't ask more than you're given." The family attorney, Mr. Roth, was an old man with parchment hands and a voice like dried leaves. He cleared his throat, once adjusted his glasses, and began, "Per the last testament of the late Harold Kane," the words spilled out like Stone's property lines, investment holdings, charitable bequests. Everything precise. Everything predictable. To Carla the estate. To the foundation a sum sizable enough to make headlines. To his biological nephew the car collection. To his protege the rare books. And that was it. Amara's name was never spoken. The room didn't shift. No one gasped. No one looked at her. It was as if she had never existed. She remained seated, hands folded, pulse steady, but the silence inside her cracked. Afterward, as guests filtered out and the day began to blur under the golden haze of twilight, she walked the garden path behind the estate, the one she used to sneak down as a child when the rules inside felt too tight to breathe. Near the greenhouse, someone was waiting. A man in his late 70s wearing a tan coat and a hat too small for his head. Miguel, the gardener. He had worked there since before she arrived. Never said much. But his eyes had always been kind in a way the Kanes never mastered. "Miss Amara," he said softly. She turned. He pulled something from his coat. An envelope. Thick. Worn. Her name handwritten across the front. "From your father," Miguel said. "He told me to wait, to give it to you after the will." "Why me?" Miguel looked at her, then not with pity but with gravity. "Because he didn't want them to know he still believed in you." She took the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have. Alone in her room, she peeled it open. Inside, a single sheet of paper folded once with no date, no letterhead. Just a sentence written in Harold Kane's unmistakable, careful script. "The one most worthy is always the one who never knew she was being hunted." She read it 3 times. Each word landed like a knock from behind a door she wasn't ready to open. Her hands shook, but not from sadness. From something older, sharper. Not betrayal, not yet, but something close. She set the letter down, stood, and walked to her closet. It took a moment to find it. The coat. The one he had given her last winter. Gray wool. Oversized. She ran her hand along the lining. Something sharp tucked into the inner seam. A key! Old, bronze, cold. She held it in her palm and sat back down. The door to room 13 had always been locked, always ignored. No one spoke of it. But now the lock had a name. She looked again at the letter. The Hunted. And something deep inside her whispered, "You were never meant to survive, just to serve." She folded the letter slowly, like closing a wound that would need to be opened again later. Then she stood, walked to the end of the hallway, and stared at that door. Number 13. Still closed, still waiting. The house was silent. The kind of silence that didn't come from absence but from anticipation. As if every wall knew something was about to be disturbed. Amara stood in the hallway just past midnight, barefoot on cold mahogany floors. The key clenched in her hand like a secret she hadn't decided whether to keep or bury. The corridor stretched long and straight, lined with familiar doors, 12 of them all identical in shape and finish. But number 13 had always been different, even when she didn't know why. It was never mentioned, never acknowledged. No cleaning staff entered it. No guest was ever curious. Even Carla, who ran the house like a museum curator, pretended it didn't exist. When Amara was a child, she thought maybe it was a closet. Maybe it was storage. Maybe it was nothing. But she had never believed that. Not really. She reached the door and hesitated. Her fingers hovered above the handle heart, thrumming so hard it felt like her ribs might bruise from the inside. She slid the old bronze key into the lock. It didn't fight. It turned easily, as if the door had just been waiting for her to be ready. The latch gave with a soft, deliberate click. She exhaled and pushed. The door opened inward with the weight of something unspoken. The room beyond wasn't dusty or forgotten. It was preserved, maintained, dimly lit by a single desk lamp that someone had at some point left switched on as if they'd intended to return. The air inside smelled faintly of leather and old paper. It wasn't a bedroom. It wasn't a storage closet. It was an archive. Dozens of filing cabinets lined the walls, each meticulously labeled in Harold's crisp handwriting: probate petitions, federal proceedings, private hearings, estate transfers. On the back wall stood a bookshelf filled not with novels or memoirs, but with black binders, each spine marked by year. She stepped inside slowly, heart thudding. Her fingers trailed over one drawer. 2001. Testimonies state level. She pulled it open. Inside were folders, hundreds of them, typed, stamped, notated. But it wasn't the size or the volume that stopped her. It was the names. One folder, Dawson vs. Commonwealth. She remembered that one, vaguely. A man accused of embezzlement from a healthcare nonprofit, convicted in '01. Her high school had done a mock trial on it. The file inside was thicker than she expected. There were testimonies, but something was wrong. The notary's signature on one of the key affidavits had a name she recognized not from law, but from the Kane Foundation's Christmas parties. A woman named Barbara Hennings, Carla's longtime assistant. But she wasn't a legal notary. Not in 2001. The dates didn't match. Next file. Carmichael v. State of Massachusetts. Same problem. Witness inconsistencies. Testimonies revised after filing. One document had a signature page stapled in slightly different paper stock. Wrong typeface. And over again. A quiet pattern of manipulation. These weren't clerical errors. They were interventions. Precise. Undetectable to the public eye, but clear to someone trained to look. Amara pulled binder after binder off the shelves. Cases that had made headlines, others that hadn't. At least a dozen showed signs of being reworked after final judgment. Harold Kane hadn't just ruled on them, he had rewritten them. But for what? That's when she saw it. A drawer labeled simply Custodial Records, 1999. She paused. Her fingers trembled before touching the metal. Something in her body recoiled. Some ancient warning that whispered, "You already know what's in here, don't open it." She opened it. There were only 5 folders inside. One had her name, Amara E. Kane, intake. She slid it out. The folder felt too heavy for its thickness. She opened the flap. The first page was a guardianship declaration, not an adoption form. Not a certificate of legal custody, not an order of parental claim. A temporary guardianship agreement, filed under Emergency Provision 14B, signed by Harold Kane, witnessed by Carla, expedited through the family court judge that Harold had appointed 5 years prior. Provisional custody granted due to subject's anonymous status post-trauma. And beneath it in red ink, custodial designation for estate continuity pending settlement. Her hands gripped the paper harder than she meant to. It crinkled under her fingers. Her name sat at the top of the document like it didn't belong there, as if it had been placed, not given. She flipped to the second page. It was a hospital intake form, the kind used for ER admissions. There is a photograph, a grainy Polaroid stapled to the top right. Her age 4, eyes dazed, hair bloodied, the same face she carried now just hollowed by trauma. Undername unknown. Female. East Asian descent. Date of birth Est. May 10th, 1995. Amara's official birthday was May 11th. She blinked. Her mouth opened, but no breath came. She turned the page. Next was a petition to amend identity. Filed not in 1999, but in early 2000. It included a request to change the name from Jane Doe 1999B to Amara Elaine Kane to match custodial coherence. There was a handwritten note in the margin. Ensure all existing records reflect new DOB. Easier for school enrollment. Do not retain originals. The signature at the bottom wasn't Harold's. It was Carla's. Amara let the folder slide from her hands. It hit the desk with a soft thud that echoed far too loud in a room full of secrets. Her knees weakened. She sat. For a long moment she couldn't move, couldn't blink, couldn't breathe the same air she had just breathed moments ago. She wasn't who she thought she was. Not on paper, not in memory, not in name. Everything had been curated, crafted. Her life, her identity, even her birth date restructured like a legal clause. Not out of love, not even out of mercy, but out of necessity. Custodial designation for estate continuity. She wasn't a daughter. She was an instrument, a tool of convenience, a placeholder in a narrative too polished for her to question. Until now, she stood slowly clutching the folder to her chest. Her pulse was calm now, hollow. She looked around the room one more time. At the shelves, at the files, at the rot covered in veneer. This room wasn't a secret. It was a ledger, and someone had kept it too well. She turned off the light, stepped into the hallway, and closed the door. This time she didn't lock it. It started with a denied transaction. A coffee shop Monday morning. Amara handed over her card like always, barely thinking the barista already sliding the cup toward her when the screen on the register blinked red. The girl said politely, confused. Looks like this one didn't go through. Amara blinked. Can you try again? The girl did, twice, still declined. It wasn't the money. There had been enough money savings from years of precision stipends from the foundation accounts left in her name for future independence. But by the time she walked outside, her phone buzzed with 4 emails in rapid succession. Your account has been restricted due to administrative changes. Access revoked from mobile banking. Authorization signature removed from estate-linked savings. Name mismatch detected in trust access protocol. She stood on the sidewalk, chilled not from the air, but from the weight of the unraveling. She opened her banking app. Login failed. She tried the Kane Foundation's internal dashboard. Error 403, user not recognized. Then the card for her health insurance deactivated. By noon, she didn't just feel cut off. She was severed. Like a limb no one remembered was once part of the body. Back in her apartment, the walls felt closer than usual. Her phone screen glared with new notifications, each one worse than the last. The Boston Herald, the Chronicle, even an opinion blog from a minor law school publication. Headlines that clawed. Adopted heiress in legal standoff. Kane legacy under threat. Charity case. Turned challenger. Who is Amara Kane? Really, courtroom whisper, is this a case of ingratitude or invasion? They didn't use her voice. They didn't ask for comment. They used hers. Carla Kane's. There she was on the midday broadcast in tasteful black pearls around her neck, eyes shimmering like grief had left her just long enough to rehearse. I won't speak poorly of someone we once welcomed with open arms, Carla said, holding back what looked like tears. We took her in during a moment of great tragedy, gave her everything, a name, a home, a future. But sometimes... She paused for dramatic effect. Sometimes kindness is mistaken for weakness, and not every heart learns gratitude. The reporter leaned in like a willing participant in her performance. Do you feel betrayed? Carla's eyes lowered, then lifted, vulnerable, perfect. I feel heartbreak, nothing more. Amara stood frozen in her kitchen, the TV flickering against her skin. She hadn't turned it on. The broadcast continued photos of her as a child, pulled from family archives, smiling at birthdays she barely remembered, standing next to people who never called her anything but the girl. Over those images, the voiceover spun a narrative so tight it left no space for breath. No one said she was lying. They just made sure everyone felt like she was. By late afternoon, her email inbox flooded former colleagues, college acquaintances, even an ex from 5 years ago. Some curious, some sympathetic, most distant. The kind of people who reach out not to offer comfort, but to say they saw it, like you're a headline now, not a human. She didn't respond. She couldn't. The walls of her apartment, once neutral, now felt too quiet, like the silence had become a co-conspirator. She reached into the drawer by her bed, pulled out her passport. She flipped to the information page. It didn't look wrong. But now it didn't look real either. She checked her birth certificate again. May 11th, the wrong day. She sat down on the floor. Not the bed, not a chair, just the ground, solid, cold, familiar in its honesty. What Carla had done wasn't just legal. It was surgical. Not removing her from the will, not excluding her from the press conference, but stripping her from systems, from identity, from history. You don't need to erase someone's voice if you erase the record of them ever speaking. She looked at her reflection in the darkened TV screen. Not quite a face, just the outline of one. And for the first time, she asked herself the question she'd spent years avoiding. If your name is borrowed, your past erased, your future locked what's left of you. Her phone buzzed again. One more headline. A think piece this time. When Charity Backfires: The Dangerous Rise of Legal Entitlement Among Adopted Dependents. She didn't finish reading. She didn't need to. They were painting her as the girl who bit the hand that fed her, the orphan who demanded a throne, the outsider who never belonged. And the worst part, it was working. She saw it in the way people didn't look her in the eye at the coffee shop, in the way a receptionist at her dentist's office hesitated before saying her name as if waiting for the scandal to stain her voice. It was in the data that toned the silence. Not just erasure, eradication. Later that night, Amara sat alone on the edge of her bathtub. The door closed, the fan humming overhead like white noise trying to drown out everything. She clutched the envelope Miguel had given her, the one with Harold's note inside. The one most worthy is always the one who never knew she was being hunted. She ran her thumb along the crease over and over until the paper began to fray. What was hunting her? Not just the Kane family, but the version of herself they had curated. The grateful orphan, the poster child, the silent inheritor. She had been all those things, dutifully, carefully, but she would not be hunted anymore, and she would not be erased. Not by Carla. Not by the system, not even by the version of herself that once believed silence meant safety. She stood slowly, walked to her desk, opened her laptop, and created a blank folder. She named it Proof I Exist. Inside, she dragged the birth certificate, then the hospital intake form, then the guardianship file. Then she opened a new document and began to write. Not her defense, but her story. Not for the public, not yet, but for herself. Because if they were going to rewrite her, she'd make sure they had to burn every page to do it. She didn't sleep that night. Sleep was for people whose names weren't being erased from bank databases and headlines alike. For people whose histories hadn't been repackaged into cautionary tales. For people who didn't wake up wondering if their entire life had been a carefully constructed performance staged for legacy, not love. Amara sat at her desk with nothing but the glow of her laptop. Her reflection caught faintly in the glass of the dark window behind it. Her inbox sat open, still empty, still silent. The folder labeled Proof I Exist waited beside it. She didn't want to beg the world to believe her. She wanted to make it listen. She opened her audio editor, the one she had used years ago for a college project on narrative storytelling. It had sat untouched since. But tonight it felt like the sharpest blade she had. She didn't write a script, didn't plan an outline. She just hit record. Her voice came low, steady, unfamiliar even to her. Welcome to room 13. This is a place for what doesn't get said. A pause. I was never meant to be part of the Kane family legacy. I was meant to preserve it. Quietly, invisibly. But some rooms shouldn't stay locked. She didn't say her name, didn't identify herself. She didn't need to, not yet. She had something stronger than identity. She had receipts. She pulled out a file from the folder she'd taken from the 13th room labeled Dawson v. Commonwealth 2001. A case she'd remembered hearing about in school used as an example of decisive legal precedent. A man, Ronald Dawson, accused of embezzlement from a non-profit hospice program, sentenced to 12 years. But in the file, something had never sat right. A notarized statement from a key witness that had been inserted post-trial. The paper stock didn't match. The font spacing was off. The notary wasn't licensed at the time, and the judge who signed off on the post-trial revision, Harold Kane, her father. She laid the documents out in front of her and began to narrate. This is a case you probably never questioned, but you should have. She described the inconsistencies, the signatures that didn't align, the mysterious disappearance of a second witness, the fact that the nonprofit Dawson was accused of stealing from had 6 months later merged with a healthcare fund Carla Kane quietly sat on the board of. She didn't accuse, she questioned. Relentlessly, calmly. She let the documentation speak louder than her voice. By the time she pressed stop, her hands were cold. Her coffee had gone untouched. She added a short musical sting, minimal and haunting. Then she uploaded the episode to a freshly created channel, no author listed, no email tied to her name. She titled it simply Room 13, Episode 1, The Ghost in the Ledger. She went to bed as the sun began to rise, and for the first time in days, she fell asleep. Not in fear, but in fury. The podcast gained traction faster than she expected. At first, just a few listens, then dozens, then hundreds. Reddit threads formed. A few comments on the subreddit r/legal weird. Anyone else hear that Kane connection? This feels dangerously specific. Sounds like an inside job. She kept quiet. Let the questions simmer. Then the email arrived. No subject line, no sender name. The address itself was a string of randomized characters, but the message was clear. I worked with Dawson. I know what really happened. I have proof. Meet me. No phones. Tuesday, 9 p.m. Grady's Diner. Booth near the jukebox. Come alone. She reread it 5 times. Then she pulled up maps and searched the location. Grady's Diner. 20 minutes out of the city, old brick facade, open late. It felt like bait, but it also felt like something more dangerous to ignore an open door. Tuesday night. The diner was nearly empty. Just a couple truckers hunched over coffee. A waitress chewing gum with headphones in and a jukebox humming quietly in the corner. She stepped inside, heart thudding, every instinct sharpened to threat. Booth by the jukebox. There he was, late 50s gray in his beard, denim jacket, weathered hands. He didn't look up until she sat down. "You're her," he said. "I didn't say who I was. You didn't need to." He slid a manila envelope across the table. Thick, heavier than it looked. "I worked accounting for the nonprofit. We never lost the money. It was moved. Paper shuffled until it landed under a foundation name. That trial. That wasn't about theft. That was about ownership." "Why now?" she asked. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't admiration either. "Because now you're the only one speaking." She opened the envelope under the table. Inside, copies of bank statements, handwritten memos, minutes from meetings where Dawson's name was never mentioned but redirection of funds was. Every single paper led back to the same name, Amara Kane. And one sticky note in ballpoint ink H signed off, "Just get it sealed." Harold, her father. Her breath hitched, but she forced it down. This is real?" she asked. He gave a sad half laugh. "I've been sitting on it for years. No one ever cared enough to ask." He finished his coffee, stood. "You got your truth. Be careful with it." And he was gone. She stayed in that booth for 20 more minutes, staring down at the envelope like it was dynamite. Because it was, not just for Carla, but for Harold, her father. The man who had taught her to always put her name in ink so no one else could overwrite it. She walked back to her car, drove home with the windows cracked, the envelope on the passenger seat. And the whole time she said nothing. Not a word. Because now she didn't need to speak. She had a voice. And she had a microphone. And Room 13 was just getting started. The man from the diner had given her more than proof, he'd given her direction. Back in her apartment, Amara laid the documents across her floor like a detective mapping a crime scene. Bank statements, board meeting notes, transfer logs. The pieces didn't scream, they whispered like secrets too well dressed to be noticed. She moved between them step by step until one logo caught her eye. It was small. A seal at the bottom of a printed memo, a stylized dove perched on a branch next to 3 Latin words she'd seen hundreds of times before. Lumen Pro Vita, the Kane Foundation's official motto, light for life. She sat down hard. One of the documents, dated months before the Dawson trial, showed a quiet donation from a holding company linked to a corporate real estate developer. A donation that coincided perfectly with the misplaced funds Dawson had been blamed for stealing. She searched the company name, Seraphim Properties. They were involved in a major development deal that same year on a plot of land once owned by the hospice charity Dawson had worked for. It was all right there. A cycle of theft disguised as charity. Funds disappeared from nonprofits. Showed up in the Kane Foundation. were laundered through grants and philanthropic programs, then used to buy political favor, secure development contracts, and silence questions in court. A machine powered by generosity on paper and greed in practice. Harold's name wasn't always listed, but Carla's was, over and over again. Signatures on board minutes, approval of transfers, public speeches declaring a commitment to ethical growth. Ethics. Amara almost laughed. She opened her laptop, pulled up her podcast editor. Her voice was sharper this time, not colder but surgical. This is Room 13, Episode 2, Beat. In 2001, Ronald Dawson was convicted of embezzlement. His trial was swift, the evidence clear, the judge decisive. Another beat. But the truth was carefully placed just behind the headlines. She walked listeners through the paper trail slowly, methodically. No accusations, just revelations. Seraphim Properties donated over $600,000 to the Kane Foundation the same quarter Dawson was sentenced. Months later, they acquired land the hospice was forced to sell after the financial fallout. Coincidence? Possibly. But then why do the minutes from the Foundation's board meeting list Seraphim as a pre-approved strategic partner 3 weeks before the donation was made? She let the silence settle before continuing. And what does it mean when philanthropy becomes a mask for laundering influence? She titled the episode, Charity Justice, or the Politics of Clean Hands. She uploaded it just past midnight. By morning it had spread like oil on water. Reddit threads exploded. Twitter threads unraveled. Legal bloggers dissected the connections in real time. A law student from Stanford posted a TikTok breaking down the Foundation's tax filings with surgical precision. Hashtags bloomed. Room 13, Charity or Cover-Up, Justice for Dawson. Who's Room 13? Speculation ignited. Some believed it was a former employee. Others guessed a whistleblower. A few even floated that it might be a rogue journalist who had been blacklisted. No one suspected the erased girl from the obituary that hadn't included her name. No one thought of Amara Kane. Not yet, but they would. That afternoon, she received an email from a private address. No name attached. The message was short. You're getting close. They're going to feel it now. That same hour, Carla Kane held a press conference. In a pristine cream blazer, pearls again, flawless makeup, she stood before the city's nonprofit leaders and a half-dozen journalists from friendly outlets. The topic, protecting the integrity of philanthropy in a time of misinformation. Amara watched from her laptop as Carla cleared her throat with practiced grace and said, "We live in an era where shadows speak louder than truth, where nameless voices armed with half-facts and dangerous assumptions can harm decades of honest work." She didn't name the podcast. She didn't have to. Everyone already knew what she meant. But the moment that made Amara's stomach turn wasn't Carla's words, it was the audience. They clapped, nodded, smiled. Because Carla Kane wasn't just a woman with a foundation. She was a symbol, a brand of unshakable moral elegance cultivated for years, brick by brick, gala by gala. And now Amara had thrown a match at the edge of that house. She sat in silence for a moment, not shaken, but recalibrated. This wasn't just going to be about truth. It was going to be about endurance. She pulled up the download stats for the podcast. Over 48,000 listens in 24 hours. Mentions in 5 legal blogs. One investigative newsletter had already reached out. The thread had been tugged, and now the whole sweater was unraveling. She scrolled through anonymous comments. Finally, someone's naming names. Room 13 is the most important podcast this year. This feels like the next big trial. Hope they're careful. Whoever you are, keep going. Amara leaned back in her chair, the city noise humming outside her apartment window. Carla had the press, the foundations, the cameras, and the pearls. But Amara had something else. She had the file room. She had the receipts. And now finally she had an audience. This time she wouldn't be erased. Not by silence. Not by spin. Not by the woman who called herself mother only when the cameras were watching. And as the sun began to set, Casting amber light across the folders scattered across her floor, Amara whispered what she would make the title of episode 3. Let's see how much light truth can handle. It happened on a Wednesday. A press conference. Midday. No warning. Carla stood at a podium outside the Kane Foundation headquarters, flanked by 2 men in charcoal suits and a woman in a soft pink blazer. Her attorney, a family psychologist, and the head of PR. The cameras were already rolling. Before we begin, Carla said, her voice trembling with practiced restraint, I want to thank everyone who's reached out with kindness. This has been a painful time for our family. Behind her, a screen lit up with the title slide Protecting Truth and Protecting Those We Love. Amara watched from the corner of her apartment, seated cross-legged on the floor, the glow from her laptop screen flickering across her face. She'd seen Carla perform before at fundraisers, board meetings, holiday galas, but never like this. This was not a mother defending her name. This was a tactician preparing for war. Carla continued, hands folded over her heart. There has been confusion lately. Accusations, anonymity, and a great deal of pain. I want to be clear, we love Amara, we always have. But sometimes, love isn't enough. The psychologist stepped forward, clearing her throat gently. I was first consulted regarding Amara when she was 18, she said. There were signs of anxiety, mood instability, difficulty managing emotional triggers. She was at that time encouraged to begin therapy, including the consideration of medical support. The implication landed like a pin through glass. They weren't denying what Amara had claimed. They were undermining the credibility of the person who claimed it. The PR director pulled up a statement as if reciting from scripture. In light of recent digital attacks on the Kane Foundation, we want to be transparent about a long-standing concern for Amara's mental well-being. We have always tried to help quietly, but when that pain becomes public harm, we have no choice but to speak. The message was clean, slick, and devastating. Amara wasn't corrupt. She was unstable, not lying, just confused. And who listens to a voice when the world's already decided it's broken? She closed the laptop. Her breath was steady, but her hands weren't. They had weaponized her vulnerability. She hadn't hidden her therapy. She had been open with Carla about the panic attacks when she turned 18. The sleepless nights, the overthinking, the weeks she'd spent at college holding herself together with coffee and prayer. Carla had called her brave then, had kissed her forehead and said, "Thank you for trusting me." And now she'd used that same truth like a blade. Amara walked to her bookshelf, pulled down a thin folder. Her health records. She kept everything. Inside notes from her old therapist, Dr. Shelley Lynn. Notations confirming mild generalized anxiety. A few counseling sessions. No diagnoses of instability, no hospitalizations, no prescriptions. She scanned the pages into her laptop. Then she opened the next folder, labeled simply Audio. Carla. She'd almost forgotten about it. A clipped segment from a Kane Foundation gala 4 years ago. Amara had been running logistics behind the scenes. She'd carried a wireless mic in her pocket by accident, forgotten to power it down. The feed had recorded for nearly 47 minutes before cutting. She hit play. Carla's voice came through clear, sharp mid-conversation. We never intended to keep her past 18, but when Harold saw how seamless she made the estate transition, he insisted. She was useful. Legal continuity. A cleaner image than the nephew, obviously. A pause. Laughter dry and amused. She was never the plan. Just a placeholder with a pretty face. Amara didn't flinch. She knew what she had been. But hearing it, it was different. She clipped the audio to 25 seconds. Added only one sentence in voiceover. When silence is used to protect power breaking, it isn't betrayal, it's justice. She titled the episode Room 13. Episode 3, The Girl Who Was Useful. She uploaded it that night. No warning, no promotion. Let the truth do what it always did when it was clean. Burn. By morning, it had over 300,000 plays. A viral tweet with the audio clip topped 500,000 views. Comments flooded in. They just tried to play the "she's crazy" card and lost. Who uses someone's therapy against them? That's not family. That's PR strategy. She was never a daughter to them. She was a prop. The tide shifted. Not completely, but undeniably. Her inbox flooded not with pity, but with fury. Dozens of women adopted, fostered, discarded. People whose mental health had been used to silence them. Whose stories were edited by others before they could speak. And amidst them, one email stood out. From Dr. Lynn. Subject RE, your file. Amara. I saw the press conference. And the clip. I remember you clearly. You weren't unstable, you were careful. You didn't need treatment. You needed space. Let me know if I can issue a statement. I will. You weren't broken. They just needed you to look that way. Shelley. Amara sat still, the message glowing on her screen. Outside the city kept moving cars, rushing by horns in the distance. But inside her apartment, the quiet had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was potent. She had been rewritten in public, framed as fragile, damaged, dangerous in her unreliability. And then through her own voice, her own receipts, her own tenacity, she rewrote herself, not the girl who cracked, the woman who endured. And the podcast wasn't just survival anymore. It was declaration. Room 13 wasn't a whisper behind a locked door. It was a loudspeaker. And it was just getting louder. The envelope was plain. No return address. Just her name handwritten in blue ink, careful cursive. Amara Kane tucked into the slit of her apartment mailbox like a whisper waiting to explode. She knew the moment she touched it that it wasn't from a stranger. She opened it in silence, the paper trembling between her fingers. Inside was a folded legal letterhead from Reynolds & Pierce, LLP. The body of the letter was short 4 lines. Amara, I represented your father, Garrett Kane, for 18 years. What was read at the will reading is not what he signed with me in 2022. There was another version never filed. I believe you deserve to see it. Meet me. Jonathan Pierce. Amara didn't wait. By that evening, she was sitting in the back booth of a barely lit diner in Cambridge. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions, and every surface carried the quiet scuff marks of people who'd had things to hide. Jonathan Pierce was already there. He looked older than the framed headshots she remembered from the Kane family law firm gala, his gray hair thinning, his fingers twitching slightly around a steaming mug of coffee. He didn't offer small talk. He slid a leather folder across the table. This, he said, was what your father intended. Amara opened it. Inside a scanned, dated and notarized draft last will and testament of Garrett Kane. Her eyes skipped over formalities, scanning line by line until she saw it. To be dispersed to Miss Amara Kane, I leave the following. Ownership and editorial control of the Kane Civic Accountability Initiative. $2.3 million held in reserve account 7843 restricted solely for the operation of an independent investigative journalism center to be established at her discretion. Because justice is not only what is handed down, it's what is revealed. Amara closed the folder. It wasn't just money. It was intention. It was legacy. It was proof. Proof that Garrett hadn't forgotten her. Proof that he had built something for her, and someone had taken a knife to it. Jonathan stirred his coffee. They replaced it. Carla and the estate lawyer, I'm guessing under pressure. The draft I gave you was never officially filed. They filed a revision just 3 months before he died. I wasn't in the room for that one. What happened to you after she asked? He smiled without warmth. I resigned. Quietly. They offered me a settlement to walk away. I took it. I shouldn't have. I kept a copy of this because Garrett didn't trust many people, but he trusted me to make sure the right hands got the right tools. He looked up at her then for the first time. You're those hands? By dawn, Amara had retained counsel. Not a white-collar firm with cocktail hour billing, but a lawyer who'd worked on wrongful inheritance cases for years. A woman named Lucia Tran. the daughter of a whistleblower and the kind of person who wrote court motions like they were manifestos. Together they filed Case 23 CV0874. Plaintiff Amara Kane. Defendants Carla Kane, Estate Manager of the Kane Foundation and Samuel Ellsworth Probate Counsel. Allegations: falsification of testamentary documents, obstruction of estate intent, identity, erasure for financial gain. The legal brief was 47 pages. Page 8 contained the most devastating line: the plaintiff's name was intentionally omitted not due to estrangement, but to facilitate the unlawful consolidation of control by remaining heirs after a pattern of legal manipulation stretching back over 2 decades. The moment the suit went public, local news outlets grabbed it like fresh oxygen. Kane Harris strikes back. Lawsuit alleges will tampering. Whistleblower daughter podcast host files suit against prominent legal family. One by one they came knocking. The podcast views surged again. But now it wasn't just her voice echoing in headphones. It was her name in court documents, her story on legal record, her fight weaponized by truth. Amara didn't feel triumphant. She felt surgical. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. Back in her apartment, she unfolded the draft will again, ran her fingertips over the paragraph that bore her name. The fund Garrett had created was more than money. It was a weapon of light. He hadn't wanted her to follow his path: judgeship, prosecution, institutional power. He'd wanted her to expose the places even courts wouldn't touch. It explained everything now. Why he had always encouraged her curiosity, her instinct to question. Why he'd built that locked room. Why he'd never told Carla. He hadn't just adopted her. He'd entrusted her. And Carla had known. That's why she'd buried it. Buried Amara. Tried to drown her in the narrative of mental illness, of gracelessness, of resentment. But Amara had surfaced, and she was bringing the entire house of false memory with her. 2 nights later, she uploaded episode 4. The Will That Wasn't. She didn't name names. Not yet. But she read directly from the unfiled will, voice steady. She paused. Let the weight of the language land. Because justice is not only what is handed down, it's what is revealed. Then she spoke not as an orphan or a daughter or an activist, but as a fire starter. This was never about inheritance. It's about erasure. When you change someone's name, remove them from the story, rewrite them into something convenient, you don't just steal from them. You steal from everyone who believes the story you sold. And I'm here to take the story back. The episode ended in silence. Not music, not ads. Just breath. Her breath. Still present. Still heard. Still here. The voice didn't crack. It came through the speakers like a quiet confession in an empty church, steady, deep, unwavering. If they turn their backs on that girl, if they try to erase her, manipulate her, vilify her, then let it be known she's the only one who ever saw the light in this place. Garrett Kane, recorded 2022. The episode dropped at 7:13 p.m. No intro music, no disclaimers, no ads. Just the voice of a father once feared on the bench, now immortalized on tape, speaking from the grave like a whisper that refused to die. Episode 5, The Forged Will, The Real Trust. It spread like blood in water. Within 10 minutes, a tweet with the audio clip had 47K likes. Within an hour, the podcast trended number 2 on Apple's investigative drama chart. By morning, it was everywhere. Justice for Amara. Our Room 13 Truth. Hatch Kane Conspiracy. Screenshots of Garrett's quote flooded Instagram stories stitched onto black backgrounds with glowing text. She's the only one who ever saw the light. And for the first time, people weren't just curious. They were angry. The Kane family, once untouchable, scrambled. By dawn, the PR firm behind 3 state senator re-elections had been retained. By noon, Carla Kane appeared on television again. This time her voice was colder. She looked less like a grieving mother, more like a CEO at war. There are a lot of rumors right now, she said smoothly, seated in a staged living room interview beside her attorney, Martin Bell. Grief sometimes takes people down dangerous roads. Martin Bell nodded solemnly. "We are saddened that a member of the family has chosen to lash out in this way. Mental stress, trauma, confusion, all understandable after a parent's death. But none of that excuses libel. They didn't call her by name. They didn't have to. Everyone knew who they were talking about. And worse, Bell wasn't just a lawyer. He was a specialist in media silencing, known for turning narratives upside down in defamation cases, with a track record of publicly demolishing whistleblowers by manufacturing concerns about their emotional stability. Amara watched the interview from the edge of her bed. She didn't blink. 2 hours later, the Kane legal team sent a cease and desist letter to her inbox. Formal, aggressive, threatening. Refrain from broadcasting, republishing, or distributing any further materials related to the private affairs of the late Garrett Kane and/or the Kane estate. Failure to do so will result in immediate legal action for defamation, slander, and reputational damage. She didn't respond. Instead, she opened her editing software. Episode 6 was already halfway built. The screen blinked at her like an invitation. She leaned into the mic, spoke calmly. "They say grief makes people unstable. They say truth is dangerous when held by the wrong hands. But I say if your truth is strong, you don't need to silence others to hold it up." Then she dropped the audio from Garrett's second recording, a personal conversation from the year before he died, unreleased until now. In it, his voice was softer, more vulnerable. "If anything happens to me, they'll bury the right will. Carla knows it won't serve her, but the law isn't just what's signed, it's what people are willing to fight for. Amara's the only one who'll fight." She clipped that line, put it on loop, ended the episode with silence again. The world roared. Justice for Amara hit number 1. Journalists picked it up. Podcasters debated it. Law students on Reddit dissected the forged will allegations line by line. TikTok accounts made dramatizations of Room 13. Artists drew fan art of Amara with a golden key. People started sharing stories of their own inheritance erasures, family cover-ups, legal gaslighting. The Kane brand, once immaculate, was now a meme. One photo of Carla in court was captioned, "When the forged will starts sweating." But none of it made Amara feel triumphant. She knew better. This wasn't over. Not even close. Back behind the curtain, Bell and his team were preparing for war. They filed a preliminary injunction request attempting to block all further episodes of Room 13 pending the resolution of the inheritance case. In the motion, they claimed, Amara Kane is weaponizing a fabricated narrative to sway public perception in a matter still under judicial review. Her content is causing irreparable damage to the Kane family name brand and philanthropic endeavors. The judge gave them a hearing. 3 days. That's all Amara had. 3 days to keep her voice alive. So she prepared. Not just another podcast, but something else. A public hearing. A live podcast stream with invited press, live audience, and a series of recorded witnesses who were already stepping forward, people who'd been wrongfully sentenced by her father. Others whose donations to the Kane Foundation disappeared into shadow nonprofits. If they wanted her quiet, they'd have to silence her in front of the world. And in that moment, sitting alone with headphones on, surrounded by notes and hard drives, and the voice of a dead man who'd trusted her to dig up the truth, Amara didn't feel like a girl without a name anymore. She felt like a reckoning. She walked into the courtroom without makeup. No press team, no stylist, no entourage. Just a black dress. A chain around her neck bearing a small gold key. And in her hand, an old weathered leather folder, the kind not used in years, corners, frayed stitching unraveled. Inside it, her war. The judge was already seated. A woman in her 60s, steely-eyed, who had once clerked under Garrett Kane. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. To Amara's right sat Carla Kane's spine, stiff as iron, lips painted the same shade as always, rose gilt. Her lawyer, Martin Bell, leaned in and whispered something. She didn't nod. She didn't blink. The courtroom was full. Journalists elbowed one another in the back row. Law students sat wide-eyed on the edge of their benches. Even former associates of Judge Kane were there waiting to see if the giant they had once admired had built his house on a foundation of fraud. Then the judge spoke. "Ms. Amara Kane, you may begin." She didn't speak at first. She pulled out a small audio player and pressed play. No intro, no commentary, just a voice. "If they try to erase her, they erase me. She was the only one who ever challenged me, and I trusted her to do it." The voice of Garrett Kane. Amara let it ring out and die into silence. Then she reached into the folder and removed a yellowed page, its corners crisp with age but ink clear and legible. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "This is a copy of a will dated 3 months before Judge Kane's death. It was never filed. It names me as the steward of a public fund, not a beneficiary, but a protector. A creator of a journalism trust aimed at holding power accountable." She stepped forward, placed it on the evidence table. Next, a leather-bound journal. Pages flagged, marked in red. Personal entries. Notes from Garrett's final year. Transcripts of conversations, internal debates, doubts, regrets, mentions of the Room 13 files, and then emails. Printed exchanges between Carla and their family attorney about destroying the earlier version of the will, marked confidential. Amara took a breath. "The files I found in Room 13 detail not just my identity being changed, but judicial interference in over a dozen cases. Many connected to financial partners of the Kane Foundation." She turned to face Carla. "The foundation used my name on every poster, every newsletter. Amara's Future, a program to promote equality, transparency, law for all, but it was never mine, just like the name you gave me." Bell stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is character assassination. These documents have not been authenticated." "They have," Amara interrupted, eyes locking onto his. She reached in once more. One last envelope. Inside, a notarized statement from Garrett Kane's former clerk signed 2 weeks before the judge's passing. In it, he confirmed witnessing the drafting of a second will and that it was suppressed after his death. "This," Amara said, her voice now a sharpened blade, "isn't about money, or even justice for me. I'm not seeking control of the estate. I'm not claiming the house, the accounts, or the title. All I want—" She paused. Her hands gripped the sides of the podium. Her breath didn't shake. "Is for the truth to stand. Without disguise, without inheritance, without apology." Silence. It fell like snow over a cemetery. The judge said nothing. Bell said nothing. Even Carla didn't move. The weight of the words, "I don't want the money. I want the truth to stand." It rearranged the atmosphere. You could hear someone shift their coat in the gallery. You could hear the soft whir of a press camera clicking on. But nobody spoke. The courtroom had just become sacred ground. Then Carla's voice broke the spell. Shaky, low-forced. "She's not stable," she said. None of this makes her stable." Bell placed a hand on her forearm gently, but it was too late. The judge lifted a single brow. "Ms. Kane," she said slowly, "you'll have the opportunity to present your case in full, but I will not allow character attacks as a substitute for defense." Then she looked back to Amara. "And you, Ms. Kane, have you submitted this evidence for forensic review?" "I have," Amara replied. "It will be entered as preliminary evidence." The judge turned. "This hearing is adjourned until Friday morning." As the gavel came down, Amara turned and faced the press. Flashbulbs ignited, but she didn't stop, didn't pose, didn't smile. She walked past them, down the hallway, toward the exit, and for a split second, as the glass doors of the courthouse opened and light poured over her like absolution, Amara felt something unfamiliar wash over her skin. Not victory, not vindication, but the start of what? She didn't know yet. But whatever it was, it had finally begun. The courtroom was colder than usual. The judge had requested no press, no audience, just the principal parties. But word had already broken outside. Reporters pressed their faces against the frosted glass like moths against flame. Inside, Amara stood, hands at her side. Not clenched, not trembling, just still. The judge entered without ceremony. No rustle of robes, no small talk. She looked exhausted, like she'd carried the weight of 3 legacies through one sleepless night. She cleared her throat, then spoke. After review of authenticated documents, witness statements, notarized journals, and forensic analysis of voice recordings submitted to the court, this court finds that the revised will of the late Judge Garrett Kane is valid and enforceable. The words didn't echo. They detonated. Carla's face cracked without breaking. Her red lips curled just slightly, but no sound emerged. The man beside her bell kept a blank stare, the kind of cold neutrality only lawyers know how to wear when they're losing. Amara didn't move, not even to breathe. Then the judge continued. This court orders that control over the Kane estate be immediately relinquished from Carla Kane and all listed heirs. Furthermore, a federal inquiry into financial misrepresentation and obstruction of justice has been recommended to the Attorney General's office. She looked directly at Carla. You may remain seated until federal agents arrive. A stillness thicker than silence swallowed the room. And then one final decree. The foundation detailed in the enforceable will, an independent investigative journalism platform will be legally recognized and Ms. Amara Kane will assume full founder status. It was over. Not just the hearing, not just the war of documents and tapes and poisoned smiles. The entire illusion was gone. The facade that the Kane family had built a dynasty of verdicts, donations, and curated morality crumbled like ash. One verdict at a time, one lie undone. As she exited the courtroom, Amara didn't smile. The courthouse lobby erupted, flashbulbs, reporters screaming questions, hashtags already trending. But she didn't stop for sound bites. A security guard moved to block the press, but Amara raised a hand. No, she whispered. She stepped forward, stood at the top of the marble stairs. Dozens of microphones thrust toward her face. She said nothing, just pulled a small envelope from her coat pocket, held it high. This is my father's letter, she said. He called me the only one who ever challenged him. Today I challenge every system that turns justice into performance, that buries truth beneath names, bloodlines, and bank accounts. A beat. Then, we're launching the 13th room this Friday. Our first story, the case of Malik Torres, convicted in 2002, sentenced by Garrett Kane, and now possibly innocent. Across the country it hit like lightning. News anchors gasped. Breaking news out of Boston, where a young woman formerly disowned, unacknowledged, has successfully exposed judicial corruption at the highest level. Twitter exploded. 13th room, #justice for Amara, side Garrett Kane legacy exposed. In the city, a protest was forming, young law students carrying signs that read, "Truth doesn't belong to bloodlines, and Amara gave us back the law." But in a quiet part of the city, in a hospital room smelling of antiseptic and old linens, an elderly man stared at a muted TV screen. He had testified in Amara's case, an old court clerk from 1999. And as he watched her image flash across the screen, walking out into sunlight, with nothing but a file folder and a key on her necklace, he smiled. "Told you she wasn't done," he whispered. The legal tide kept rising. Hours later, federal agents entered the Kane estate with a warrant. Carla Kane was photographed sitting in her rose-colored lounge, hands folded, refusing to speak. Her son Matthew silent. Her daughter Genevieve posted a story we had no idea. We were just children. The public didn't care. Subpoenas began rolling out for past donors to the Kane Foundation. Financial forensics were already underway. And buried in the newsfeed that day, almost unnoticed, was a tiny headline in the Boston Tribune. Prosecutors reopen case of Malik Torres. Evidence found in room 13 suggests misconduct. It had begun. Not vengeance. Not destruction. But cleansing. Amara sat in the window of her apartment that night. The lights from downtown shimmered across the water. Her phone buzzed, emails piling in, journalists wanting interviews, whistleblowers reaching out, law professors quoting her courtroom statement. But she didn't reply. She was listening to the first rough mix of her podcast's new season. Her own voice. They thought I came for inheritance. They were wrong. I came for the truth they buried with my name. Outside, the city exhaled. For the first time in decades, justice didn't sound like a gavel. It sounded like a woman speaking clearly into a microphone and refusing to be erased. The house felt different now, quieter, as if it too had exhaled. Amara stepped through the threshold of the Kane estate, not as a daughter, not as a guest, not even as a ghost from the margins of its lineage. She stepped in as a woman who had faced the full weight of silence, deception, and shame and hadn't flinched. The staff was gone. The portraits of Garrett Kane had been taken down during the federal sweep. But one hallway remained untouched, because no one had dared to walk it since the verdict. The 13th door. Amara stopped in front of it. Her hand hovered just for a moment over the knob. Not from fear, from reverence, like a soldier returning to a battlefield long after the war was over, and yet still sacred. She opened it. The air was stale, ink-stained, thick with the dust of misjudgments and names erased from court records. Stacks of files, color-coded, categorized by year and jurisdiction, still lined the mahogany shelves. Folders that once held the fate of men, women, and children in the balance of forged verdicts and bought silence. She moved slowly, tracing her fingers over one file after another. Every folder held a ghost. Every box held a scream that had never made it into the record. Then she lit the match. No ceremony, no words, just flame. The fire caught gently at first, as if uncertain it was allowed to destroy the very structures that had upheld power for so long. Then it grew bolder, consuming years of manipulation, page by page, ruling by ruling. In the golden flicker, her face was stone and softness all at once. She only kept one file. It was the case of Malik Torres, the man whose wrongful conviction had begun this unraveling. The name she wanted to remember, not as a reminder of shame, but of responsibility. She slipped it into her leather satchel and turned away from the fire. The shelves were blackened now, charred, empty, but the room was not. She walked to the door, unscrewed the old plaque that read Storage B13, and replaced it with one she had brought in her coat pocket. It was handmade, wood-carved, painted by her own hands over the course of 2 nights when sleep refused to come. It read, Room of Justice where the voice begins. And beneath that, in honor of those silenced and those yet to speak. She sat down at the long table in the center. It had once been where clerks sorted forged documents. Now it was bare, except for a single envelope. It was postmarked 3 days ago. The handwriting was careful, slanted. The return address was from a children's home in New Hampshire. Amara opened it. A folded sheet of paper torn from a school journal. Dear Miss Amara, my name is Lacey. I live in a home with other kids. We don't have last names yet, not real ones. I heard your voice on a podcast that one of the big kids let me listen to. You said your name wasn't always yours either. I don't know mine yet, but I liked the way you told the story. You didn't sound scared. You sounded like someone who knew where to put their voice. I hope someday I know where to put mine. Love, Lacey, age 9. Amara didn't cry. She folded the letter, slid it into her notebook. Then she opened her laptop, plugged in her mic. A new recording session began. Welcome back to the 13th room. Today's episode is dedicated to Lacey and all those still waiting for their names, their truths, their chance. Today we're not exposing a scandal. We're rebuilding a space, not from the ashes of what burned, but from the breath of what now dares to speak. Outside, the sun broke through overcast skies, and somewhere in a home filled with children whose stories had yet to be written, a little girl leaned closer to a radio and listened, as if her own name was finally echoing back. The house felt different now, quieter, as if it too had exhaled. Amara stepped through the threshold of the Kane estate, not as a daughter, not as a guest, not even as a ghost from the margins of its lineage. She stepped in as a woman who had faced the full weight of silence, deception, and shame, and hadn't flinched. The staff was gone. The portraits of Garrett Kane had been taken down during the federal sweep, but one hallway remained untouched, because no one had dared to walk it since the verdict. The 13th door. Amara stopped in front of it. Her hand hovered just for a moment over the knob. Not from fear, from reverence. Like a soldier returning to a battlefield long after the war was over, and yet still sacred. She opened it. The air was stale, ink-stained, thick with the dust of misjudgments and names erased from court records. Stacks of files, color-coded, categorized by year and jurisdiction, still lined the mahogany shelves. Folders that once held the fate of men, women, and children in the balance of forged verdicts and bought silence. She moved slowly, tracing her fingers over one file after another. Every folder held a ghost. Every box held a scream that had never made it into the record. Then she lit the match. No ceremony, no words, just flame. The fire caught gently at first, as if uncertain it was allowed to destroy the very structures that had upheld power for so long. Then it grew bolder, consuming years of manipulation page by page, ruling by ruling. In the golden flicker, her face was stone and softness all at once. She only kept one file. It was the case of Malik Torres, the man whose wrongful conviction had begun this unraveling. The name she wanted to remember, not as a reminder of shame, but of responsibility. She slipped it into her leather satchel and turned away from the fire. The shelves were blackened now, charred, empty. But the room was not. She walked to the door, unscrewed the old plaque that read Storage B13, and replaced it with one she had brought in her coat pocket. It was handmade, wood-carved, painted by her own hands over the course of 2 nights when sleep refused to come. It read, Room of Justice where the voice begins. And beneath that, in honor of those silenced and those yet to speak, she sat down at the long table in the center. It had once been where clerks sorted forged documents. Now it was bare, except for a single envelope. It was postmarked 3 days ago. The handwriting was careful, slanted. The return address was from a children's home in New Hampshire. Amara opened it. A folded sheet of paper torn from a school journal. Dear Miss Amara, my name is Lacey. I live in a home with other kids. We don't have last names yet, not real ones. I heard your voice on a podcast that one of the big kids let me listen to. You said your name wasn't always yours either. I don't know mine yet, but I liked the way you told the story. You didn't sound scared. You sounded like someone who knew where to put their voice. I hope someday I know where to put mine. Love, Lacey, age 9. Amara didn't cry. She folded the letter, slid it into her notebook. Then she opened her laptop, plugged in her mic. A new recording session began. Welcome back to the 13th room. Today's episode is dedicated to Lacey and all those still waiting for their names, their truths, their chance. Today we're not exposing a scandal. We're rebuilding a space, not from the ashes of what burned, but from the breath of what now dares to speak. Outside, the sun broke through overcast skies. And somewhere in a home filled with children whose stories had yet to be written, a little girl leaned closer to a radio and listened, as if her own name was finally echoing back. A month later, the foundation was real. Justice Room 13. A platform, a newsroom, a legal hub, and a safe space all in one. Amara stood in front of a modest building in South Boston. A repurposed library, now humming with the energy of interns, journalists, junior lawyers, and survivors. The walls were not pristine. The paint still chipped in places, but the air carried something electric. She looked at the newly installed sign, Justice Room 13, Investigate, Amplify, Transform. Inside, voices filled the air. Not yelling, not silenced, working, arguing cases, editing segments, preparing evidence, justice in motion. Amara led a small tour for the initial core team. Among them, a former whistleblower, a pro bono defense attorney, and an ex-reporter blacklisted from corporate media. She outlined the vision. We're not building a media empire. We're building a mirror, one that the powerful can't hide from anymore. Then a shadow crossed the threshold. Leah, her cousin, the one who had always looked away when things got too uncomfortable, who once told Amara to let the past die. Now she stood with tear-lined eyes and trembling hands. "I was wrong," Leah whispered. "You did what none of us dared. You cracked it open. You made them look. You made us all look." Amara took her hand gently. "Family isn't about who hides better. It's about who opens the door even when the hallway's burning." They sat down side by side, and behind them room 13 pulsed with new life. A legacy no longer locked away. The envelope bore no return address, just the initials CK scrawled in a trembling hand. Amara found it wedged beneath the front door of her studio at Justice Room 13. The paper inside was thick, expensive, the handwriting unfamiliar, but the weight of the words unmistakable. "We were afraid, but fear is not an excuse to erase a human being. I don't expect forgiveness. I only want you to know we watched you grow even as we tried to bury you." "Carla." Amara didn't respond. Not directly. She unfolded the microphone arm hit record and let silence breathe a moment before speaking. "Truth doesn't need an apology. It needs to be returned, fully, without edits." The podcast episode dropped at midnight. The next day, news outlets flooded with images of Carla Kane arriving at a courthouse. She wore a slate gray suit that couldn't hide the hollowness behind her eyes. Her face, once a sculpted portrait of controlled grace, now drawn haunted. The investigation had reached her doorstep. A reporter tried to catch a quote. Carla said nothing. From her apartment window, Amara watched the news feed on mute. Her tea went cold on the windowsill. No anger, no triumph, just clarity. The kind that arrives after a storm, when nothing is clean but everything is visible. Justice wasn't about punishment. It was about exposure. Amara had given the world a window. Whether they looked in was up to them. But she wasn't done. Not really. That evening, Amara walked through the halls of the Kane estate one final time, empty, now stripped of illusions and influence. She paused outside the once forbidden door, now forever open. Light filtered through the curtains, dust dancing like tiny truths suspended midair. A notebook she'd once hidden beneath the floorboards of her childhood room, her own words, her own questions, was now displayed on a shelf inside room 13 beside the brass plaque "Justice begins where silence ends." Leah stood at the doorframe watching her. "You could burn it all down," she said quietly. "I'd rather build something better," Amara replied. And she would, because some legacies aren't inherited. They're forged in fire, in doubt, in relentless pursuit of what's right. And Amara Kane, the girl without a name, had finally carved one of her own. Room 13 was no longer a secret. It was a signal. The studio lights were warm. Almost too warm. Amara sat beneath them, palms flat against the armrests of a sleek leather chair facing a seasoned host, known for cutting through pretenses like silk. For the first time, there were no filters, no voice modulation, no anonymity. The chyron read, "Amara Kane, Founder, Justice Room 13. Millions watched." The host leaned in. "Why now? Why speak in your own voice?" Amara didn't blink. Because hiding was survival. Speaking is living. What followed wasn't a spectacle. It wasn't a plea. It was a telling. Plain. Measured. She spoke of the crash, the adoption, the locked door, the erased name, the podcast, the backlash, the courtroom. "No one handed me legacy," she said in the closing minute. "I wasn't chosen to inherit. I chose to rewrite what legacy means." The host sat back. The air in the room shifted. Across the country, people stopped scrolling. Teenagers clipped quotes. Lawyers re-examined cases. Survivors whispered, "That's me." On social media, the hashtag #HadLegacyRedefined trended above politics. And for the first time, the word Amara stood alone. No footnote, no asterisk, no hyphenated identity. Just her. Unedited. The voice wasn't hidden anymore. It led. The interview didn't end when the cameras stopped. Viewers flooded forums and comment sections with stories of their own lost names, broken families, silenced truths. Justice Room 13's servers crashed twice in the hour after broadcast. Donations poured in from anonymous allies and high-profile journalists alike. That night, Amara received a message from a woman in Oregon. "My brother's case was buried 15 years ago. They called it justice. I knew it wasn't. You made me believe again." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The next podcast opened with that very message, and her voice, calm and unwavering, said justice isn't something you inherit. It's something you fight like hell to build over and over. In that moment, Justice Room 13 stopped being a platform. It became a movement. And in a quiet room lit by only her desk lamp, Amara scrolled through names, not files anymore, but volunteers. Not silence, voices. The morning light filtered into the new headquarters of Justice Room 13, warm and purposeful. Amara walked through the glass doors alone without ceremony. No cameras, no press. Just quiet steps echoing on polished floors. The space smelled of fresh paint and purpose. She paused at the center of the main hallway, where the walls bore no branding, just truth. 2 framed photographs faced each other on opposite sides. On the left, a black and white portrait of Amara Kane, dignified in his robes, eyes too tired for a man that powerful. On the right, a blown-up image pulled from a hospital file once buried. A little Asian girl wrapped in gauze face, turned sideways, unnamed, unclaimed. Beneath both hung a single bronze plaque, etched with deliberate words, Justice Room 13. The door no longer locked. Amara stood still, staring at the girl she once was. Her assistant entered from behind, holding a folder of new cases submitted anonymously to the platform. "These came in overnight," she said. "The inbox is overflowing." Amara took the folder, nodding. She turned to the wall again. "Someone out there is waiting for their door to open." She walked into her office. Minimalist, warm, no-cornered hierarchy. On her desk sat an old tape recorder and the podcast mic that started it all. Next to it, a handwritten letter from a girl in Kansas, 11 years old. "They tried to change my name too, but I kept the one I gave myself." Amara pinned it to a corkboard labeled Voices That Matter. Later that afternoon, as her team gathered for the first all-hands meeting, she addressed them not from a podium, but from a circle. Her voice was calm, assured, utterly unafraid. "I don't have a family crest," she said. "I don't have heirs or a title to pass down. What I have is a door I opened. And if we do this right, no one will ever have to wonder again if justice is something they're allowed to ask for." She looked around the room. Faces nodded. Some teared up, others tightened jaws, but all were listening. Outside, the brass plaque caught the afternoon sun. Her voice returned once more in a closing narration over black screen as the music swelled softly. "Sometimes legacy doesn't come from blood. It comes from what you dare to open for someone else." Fade out. Justice Room 13. Unlocked, unafraid, unstoppable.